So for round 2, we're going to keep this to 20 minutes. All right? I'm going to shut my mouth. That's it. Now, there's so much to talk about in all the various comic realms and so on.
True.
We're having to chop this down into small segments of subject matter. So, but we started thinking, we're just throwing around terms. Some people are watching, they have no idea what we're talking about ages, about grading, about all these things. So I'm just going to go back in time to my wheelhouse for a little bit. We're going to take this as
Stone Age?
Yes. Actually, Platinum.
No, the Platinum Age.
Most people have no idea. They've heard of Golden Age, Silver Age. They've never heard of Platinum. But we're going to fix that tonight. Because it kind of shows you where the comic book came from in America. The comic book is an American invention. All right? So what you got...
the fortune cookie.
And scene. All right, so in the late 1800s, you had newspaper comic strips, okay? And we're talking about the Yellow Kid and things that people haven't heard a lot of at this point.
Like
that was one. Dick Tracy came along a little later in the 20s. Little Orphan Annie in the 20s. Popeye and his gang in Thimble Theater came along in the 20s. But pre that, you had comic strips in the newspapers that would review the events of the day, what life was like. Simple sight gag kind of things. A lot of times they were just a single square panel. And these came out of the invention of political cartoonists creating iconic images. Thomas Nast was the most famous of those. He created what we know today as the image of Santa Claus in America. He also created the Democratic donkey and the Republican elephant. And his take on that wound up sticking. So those three iconic images, symbols in America wouldn't exist without political cartoonist Thomas Nast, and those evolved into comic strips. And the comic strips, there's a daily, short, 3-4 panel long gag each day in the paper, in black and white. On Sundays, they went all out and produced a color version, and the most popular strips took up half a page. As it would, you can imagine that was especially gorgeous for things like Flash Gordon later and whatnot. But that's where how all this started. Yeah. They started to be collected.
Bye, Tom.
That's Tom. He's one of our BC Comic staff. There you go. All right, so they started collecting these comic strips in book form for the adults, right? Because they were kids, they read them once, and at one time, and they're like, I like those. I'm going to have them around the house. These made me happy. So they started collecting these things in book form. Before they started comic books, there were always murder mystery magazines. There were pulps like The Spider and The Shadow and Doc Savage and so on. And one of those strips, I only have a couple examples on my own personal collection, but one of those strips was Bringing Up Father. This is from 1926, and it's basically a collection of the strips. They made several of these, like 9, 10 different editions. And this is a collection of the strips up to that point, maybe a best of kind of thing. And they would reprint the Sundays or the dailies that were really popular, that were the funniest, etc. And they'd either make a running, like here's half a year of comic strips in a book, so you could follow the storyline, or they'd skip around and put the best single gags, like the entire joke was in one page for that day and it wasn't continuing. And they'd mix them up in these books. This is the big book number 2. Like I said, had about 10 of them. This is from 1926, so it's rapidly approaching 100 years old. And you had a cloth binding and nice hard cardstock to hold it together because this is a big book with lots of pages. Another popular one from back in the day was Mutt and Jeff. Yes, I'm using a modern comic as a bookmark. There's a reason.
At least you didn't fold the page over.
No, I didn't. This has seen better days, but it's in one piece, and it's the same kind of thing, sight gags. Mutt and Jeff lasted all the way into the 70s, believe it or not, and a lot of people have heard of them where they might have heard, not have heard of Bringing Up Father, but this goes back so far that this strip directly references picking up this brand new guy for the New York Yankees known as the Babe, and talking about his stats. The first year the Yankees ever had Babe Ruth was in the strip. So it's like a time capsule when you check these things out. Well, eventually, if you want to get these out to the people and kids, and maybe people can't afford this, if there's an economic downturn and these things cost a little bit more money, they're a full-blown book. What if we could do it with paperback? What if we could do it like a magazine? So they start putting reprints of comic strips into a magazine form. And you get things like more fun comics, adventure comics, famous funnies. I've got one of those here. And what they did is they collected a group of, and I've lost my video.
We're still in there. We're still in there.
They collected a group of comic strips.
A couple seconds behind yourself here.
With a different set of characters on the front cover every time. But they collected a group of popular comic strips in full color, so you could get a sampling of all the cool stuff going on in that particular month. This one here happens to be Buck Rogers, straight out of the Sunday paper.
So who is the most popular character in this time frame?
In this, we're talking 1930s is when the first comic book started, early 30s.
Okay.
We're talking Buck Rogers, we're talking Popeye, Dick Tracy, Little Orphan Annie, characters that have stood the test of time, and in the late 20s also Mickey Mouse, and then other Disney characters joined in. This went on for about 10 years, until 1938, when somebody invented a superhero. But prior to 1938, most comic books were like this. Detective stories, sci-fi a little bit, but that became much more popular later. A lot of the sci-fi was in the pulps. Westerns, love stories, crime, like I say, adventure stories, lots of jungle explorers and things of this nature.
Like Tarzan, stuff like that.
Exactly, yeah. And Dick Tracy happens to be the big gun in super comics, and his strips would be reprinted here. The comic books started becoming famous for having a particular character's license, so only super comics had Dick Tracy, only famous funnies had Buck Rogers, etc. So if you wanted to see and have for yourself a comic book with your favorite character, you had to buy that book. So comics started getting a following based on who was in them, and people would compete for the newspaper strips.
Aha.
Well, and these were big. We're talking 64 pages, 2 staples, occasionally 3. Most people have never seen that. During World War II, they went down to 1 staple right in the center to save on scrap metal. So it's a lot harder to find a book with a cover attached in the war with the single staple era, because it was that much more stress on a single staple.
So what's the page difference between a Golden Age book and a modern book?
Well,
how many pages?
You know how people talk about things, you don't get...
Back in my day?
They don't make things like they used to. Well, you got 64 pages here. If you had something like World's Finest Comics...
John Young says, what about the Crimson Avenger?
Well, we're getting to all of that. Give me a second.
All right.
When we're talking about things like World's Finest Comics or World's Greatest Comics, they were so thick they had 80 to 100 pages, and they had square bindings with glue and no staples. The pages were stapled, but the covers were glued on. It's an awful lot like what we would know now as an 80 or 100-page giant issue. The square bindings. Marvel had a lot of those. DC had some.
Yeah.
When you got to Silver Age, all right, the Silver Age books, as you go through time, they rise in price a little, 10 cents, 12 cents, 15 cents, etc., and they get shorter. More narrow. They're not as wide. Its production cost caused that, so they saved a little paper by shrinking the book. Mm-hmm. It's just about the same height, but it is definitely narrower. A more modern book, we'll show you, that's skinnier yet. So less pages and less width.
For more money.
Well, yes, because of production costs and later on in time, you had to start paying your artists more because they had the rights to their own characters. You didn't here. So they paid you by the page, and you did what they told you.
So here's my question. With the Golden Age books, now if we were to set a Golden Age book, a Silver Age book, and a modern book, what would that look like? Can we see what that would look like?
Did.
I know that you did the 2.
Right.
All 3 of them are
right
there.
Here.
Aha.
Yes.
I didn't see you slip that Golden Age in there.
You can definitely see that the Golden Age was the biggest, or Super Gold, the first generation, they're even bigger. Big, heavy, lots of paper, sturdily built, and of course everything got smaller as time went on. Now, why did we stop in 1938 with the Platinum Age? Well, it didn't even have a name then. It was just, we're making comic books. Some guy invented a superhero or two, And Superman was one of the more popular of that, although some of them did exist before Superman. But the most popular, regularly produced superhero from then on was Superman, and he had millions of imitators.
Does Batman know?
Yeah, they've worked it out. I think they had a movie, and it was a fight. It was a hot mess. Anyway, the point being, from 1938 on, they started calling it the Golden Age because it was a superhero revival in the industry, and it was also the time in history, up until the 50s, that the most comic books per issue were printed and sold of all time. Prior to that, we're talking prior to 1938, back into the 1800s, it's called the Platinum Age, because those books are approaching 100 years old. And a lot of them are not found in one piece.
What are prices on Golden Age books? What if somebody were to get into Golden Age buying? What can they expect to pay?
Well, what's amazing about this is that Golden Age books, people are like, "Oh my God, that's got to be worth a fortune." Some of them are only worth $5 if they're in one piece or near mint. $10 because of the age alone. Mm-hmm. But because they're an off-brand character you've never heard of, they don't command as much money or popularity. Some people like odd things and they collect just that, so they would like them, a niche kind of thing, like love stories or what have you. But
Monster Mags.
Superheroes always, they call them the capes. Superheroes always command the highest prices, even if it's not Captain America, it's the Shield instead. Or the Crimson Avenger. Somebody that we might know, but the average person might not. Still going to get more value out of them than, say, a Super Comics. Unless you've got a first appearance of a character. If they were created in a book, that makes a difference. But just because it's old doesn't necessarily mean it's valuable, and of course, condition means everything. Just to show you real quick before I move on, artist board, back in the day, when they were drawing these things, was this size and larger. And up until recently, some still use artist board, but basically a comic page would be drawn on something like this. And it would be penciled and then inked, usually by the same guy, but not always. They had shops full of people to produce these things and knock them out. They were paid by the page. They did not have creator rights and own their characters, so they did what they were told, and they ground them out so they could make deadlines and produce as many magazines as possible, especially in the heyday when everybody was buying them, and before it cooled off. But original art is incredibly rare because most of the time it was used and then chucked. Or they flipped the page over to save on paper, drew on the backside, and then they chucked it. They didn't save them because they'd already published the comic. They didn't need it anymore. It was for printing purposes only. You'd have letterers that came in and lettered them. You'd have colorists later. But the original art, most of the time, and all of the aspects of production, the layout sheets, all that, were thrown away. These happen to be photostats of the original art of 5 out of the 6 pages of a Jim Ellis strip in this book. They actually match. Okay? So, and we obtain these from the actual, the family of the actual artist.
Hang on, Joe.
Alright, so here's Jim Ellis by Richard Fletcher. And here's the first page. And that's the photostat of the original art that the artist kept as a reference copy for the stories that he was working on and his art up to that time. This is also one of his books he had pulled right off the printing press as a file copy so that he would have reference for it. Artists did that all the time so that they would have a file of, what did I do back 3 months ago when I did this and that and the other. It took 3 to 6 months to create a comic book because of the penciling, then the inking, then the proofreading and the editing, the coloring, the lettering. They had to be produced, they had to be distributed. So something like this, if it came out in December, was produced, they started working on it middle of the year, and some of these were not monthly, some of these were quarterly, once every 3 months.
Yeah.
When the comic heyday hits, especially after the superheroes, not only were things published monthly, some of them even published twice monthly, but basically what you've seen today is pre-1938 books called the Platinum Age. Starting in 38, you have the Golden Age, and that runs till, well, that's another story. Yes, sir.
Now, can any of you imagine that though? I mean, if you're reading this thing, because I know that when I'm reading comic books now, like if I'm reading our Flash number here, 246 here,
Sure.
and 247 comes out in a month or
Right.
2 weeks, I'm already going,
Yeah.
Can you imagine having to wait 3 to however month
Oh, yeah.
or however many?
So imagine coming through the Depression in the 20s and the early
that
30s.
would cause depression, waiting on your
Exactly.
superhero.
You
If
have to
Batman's hanging over a vat and you got to wait 6 months to figure out if
I'll
he's
tell you
gone.
what, they were masters of building suspense so that you would want to buy it, and they also got very good later on at cover art, making you want to buy the whole book from the cover art just from across the room, catching your eye. And we can show you examples of that later on too.
Let me tell you.
Let's say that this thing, I mean, this is a reprint of comic strips, but if this was a book where there was a cliffhanger going on, you had to scrounge up a dime for every book you wanted to buy, which means you had to work hard or get an allowance, and your parents might not have been, might not have been working. And, some of them weren't into comic books. These kind of things the parents read, but the superheroes, sometimes that was a different story. But you had to scrounge that up, and then you had to get it before the newsstands sold out of it. And they came in stacks, wrapped with twine, and you had to get your copy before they sold out. Unless your newsman saved one for you, you had to get there before the neighborhood kids did.
We're going on. We have about 3 minutes left. Ooh, they want a spotlight on the Spectre.
The Spectre. Okay.
That was Mr. John Young.
John Young. It's gonna take me a minute to find some of those because the Spectre. Oh, by the way, that brings me back to something I was going to mention real quick. The Spectre, Our Man, not the Flash. Several of the characters that, the superheroes that were invented came out of things like More Fun Comics, Adventure Comics, The Sandman, Action Comics, okay? Was full of newspaper comic strip reprints and the superhero guy they were trying out. So you got superhero characters that were invented 20, 30, 40 issues into an already existing funny book. And that's why, they didn't start out with superheroes.
Like a Marvel
It just
Presents.
became
Well, that's where Marvel Presents got their idea
this
from.
became a super popular thing in an existing title. Right? So, to find the Spectre, as valuable as they are, I'll have to round up things like More Fun Comics, All-Star Comics, and I'll see what I can do about the original Spectre. But they're pricey. And maybe I'll find some reprints or something, but I would love to see something like the Spectre as well. I think he was underutilized.
So
an avenging spirit of justice.
Right.
We could use that.
All right. So we have roughly 1 minute left.
We are
Let's
good.
see if we can turn the video off this time.
That would be nice.
What do you think?
Probably should have the comic gremlin do it. The old guys don't know what they're doing.
The gremlins. Yes.
As it is, his tech turns purple on the screen.
tech turns purple. I think that's just there's a pill for that.
Well, that's another show.